We'll turn next to Lily Tsai, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at MIT and who has a book dealing with accountability in rural China and the kinds of things that hold local officials accountable to provide public goods even in the absence of a democratic system. So Lily, do you want the podium or just stay here? Okay, sure.
So I was alarmed to hear Yasheng mock what he calls airportology, since having done no fieldwork in China, in India ever, I aspire to be an airportologist. So perhaps because of that, and also perhaps because I've mostly taught at MIT in the political science department research design classes, many of my comments will be focused at kind of a meta level on what it means to compare India and China in an analytical way. So I thought I would speak on three main things. One, the differences between macro level and micro level comparisons, which actually might be a good segue between Prerna's presentation and the other presentations on this panel, I hope. Two, justifying the comparison between India and China at a micro level, which is what I find myself doing in a paper that I'm working on with a student, Gabrielle Crux-Wisner, at MIT, comparing India and China at a micro level. So one of the tasks that we have to do certainly is to justify that comparison. And then the third is what contributions does such a comparison at the micro level make? You know, do we get anything out of it, or is it just simply, you know, inherently interesting to compare two really large countries that collectively make up a huge proportion of the world's population? So so first, the differences between macro level and micro level comparisons. I think first, macro level and micro level comparisons tend to look at related but different substantive questions and outcomes. So with the macro panel earlier, you know, the focus really seems to be on understanding differences in development trajectories, economic outcomes, economic growth, economic development, or policies that are related to economic development. You know, Prerna's work, I think, starts to bridge what has been kind of a divide so far between macro level and micro level comparisons. You know, if you're once you start to think about differences in state capacity, then you start to really think about how that. I mean, certainly differences in state capacity have an enormous effect on what's happening at the micro level. So the focus of micro level comparisons really seems to be political behavior by individuals, political and economic behavior by individuals, who petitions, who protests, who's entrepreneurial, who votes, who trusts the government, who doesn't, who supports the regime, who doesn't. And relatedly, and again, this connects up with the panel earlier, local level governance and public goods provision. So the provision of whether it's education or infrastructure, healthcare, and so forth. And that really grows out, at least in political science, out of two different developments over the last 10 years. One, I think, comes from the development community and their increasing emphasis on bottom-up kinds of development, participatory governance, and then within the realm of political science, an increasing focus on large N research, statistical methods, and so forth. And so with the increasing availability of data, which is still limited from India and China, you get more and more micro-level comparisons that are focusing on these outcomes. So I would first say that the outcomes seem to be different, the substantive questions that we look at, even though I think increasingly they are becoming more and more closely linked. Number two, we tend to structure, I think, the comparison differently in terms of values on the relevant control variables. So at the macro level, you know, it really seems to be a comparison, or at least historically, the comparison has been to frame India and China as most similar cases. You know, in some way, they start from a set of kind of similar initial conditions. You know, Yasheng was saying in 1990 they have been said to start from the same level of GDP, and then the rate of growth diverges. You know, now there's some questioning of that. Prasenjit talks about similar initial conditions, similar goals, initial goals for the rural population, and then the trajectories and paths diverge. Now, again, there's some questioning and interrogation of whether or not they really are most similar cases, but the debate seems to be about whether they are or they aren't. At the micro level, I've actually always thought of India and China as most different cases, and perhaps that's because I think mostly about outcomes that are political and that have to do with political behavior. But for political outcomes, certainly, as Perna has pointed out, there are really big differences in terms of regime type. I mean, the operative differences seem to be regime type, a democratic multi-party system versus a communist one-party system. And then after regime type, things like ethnic heterogeneity, caste structure, and state capacity. And then, of course, I think this came up in the first panel. It came up from Yenching's comment on, federal versus unitary, fiscal versus political decentralization. So they seem like from the bottom looking up, they seem like most different cases. And then, to me, what has been interesting is to identify similarities in outcomes and processes at the micro level. The last difference, I think, between macro level and micro level comparisons between India and China is the fact that we face different kinds of analytical challenges, and this is where the research design part of me comes out. I think that the challenge from people who are doing macro level comparison really has to do with causal inference, and this is just by virtue of the fact that you're looking at two cases. And so I can go into this in more boring depth. Certainly one of the biggest challenges at the macro level or the state level has to do with making valid inferences, which means holding all the relevant control variables constant and making the case that India and China really are very similar. So we need to do that in order to say that something really has an effect on something else. And I think Yasheng was talking about how that's very hard to do. What's actually, it might be more defensible actually to think about, imagine the counterfactual for India rather than comparing India and China. So that is technically easier. That's less of a challenge at the micro level. It's easier for us to make valid inferences. However, what we do have to worry about at the micro level is the fact that we need to make sure that the set of variables that might affect a certain outcome are more or less the same. So that's one issue at the micro level. The other issue, I think, which is, I think, more of a challenge, is actually making sure that the outcome that we're interested in means the same thing in the two different contexts. We might find that the same set of variables affects, maybe we would find that the same set of variables affects whether or not you have good roads or bad roads in a village. But we might also find that that you can't really compare road quality in Indian villages and Chinese villages, because in India all of the funding comes from above, and in China, at least before a certain period, in say before 2000, all of the funding came from within the village, or most of the funding came from within the village. So those two things are not really comparable. So this is the question of comparing apples and apples. But there's a separate question, which is, let's say you can compare apples and apples, but what apples why apples are significant in the Chinese context might be different from why they're significant in the Indian context. So for example, we might find that the same factors predict political participation in both contexts. But in a democratic system, like India, political participation is important because it's considered important for representation, a way of translating citizen preferences into public policy. But in China, which is a non-democratic context, it's not at all clear why more participation would translate into any kinds of policies that would reflect citizen preferences at all. So even though we find that the same variables lead to political participation in both contexts, political participation has a different meaning and a different significance in those two contexts. And so that makes the comparison at the micro level often very awkward. Or as my co-author Gabrielle has put it, if we think of political participation in the Indian and Chinese contexts as navigating a large system, right? So they're both about how you deal with this incredibly large, complex state. Then it makes sense to compare them. But if you think about them as, in the Indian context, something about local democratic processes, and in China, some other sort of process, then it doesn't really make sense to compare them. So that's another issue that I've had to think about increasingly as I've thought about the India-China comparison.